All right. Well, thank you very much for being here, and it's my pleasure to speak to you today. This presentation is a little bit different from the other ones that you've heard thus far this morning. This presentation, we're talking about some ideas to start some research projects. So it's, I won't be presenting any results of any studies. This is the very beginning, so I'm looking at ideas, and I'm doing a little bit of what Frater Dave was talking about in his presentation about the journal, in that I'm looking for participants who might be interested in participating in a research study and perhaps publishing. So this is kind of the beginning or the opposite end of the spectrum. So I'll talk about a couple of different projects. And the very first project that I'm going to talk about is a study of cultural influences on esoteric traditions, which is a concept that I've come up with for a research study, for which I'm looking for participants who would be subject matter experts who would be interested and willing to participate in this research study. And then I'll talk about some follow-on ideas for that research project, and then some other ideas for research projects that are unrelated to the first one. So the first one is very substantial and very thorough, and then the other ones are just some ideas of other research projects that we might undertake. So I would like to start by talking a little bit about the liberal arts. Frater Dave has been asking me for a couple of years to head projects on the liberal arts, to encourage some publications in the liberal arts in the journal. And so what are liberal arts? What does that mean? There's a common misconception that liberal arts are not sciences. So that's not true. If you can see on this list that the liberal arts includes mathematics, physics, zoology, botany, chemistry, so even engineering, and some programs that we don't necessarily think of as being liberal arts. Liberal arts is really the basis of human knowledge and production. So it even includes the fine arts. Theater and music are included inside the liberal arts. So just because we classify something as a liberal art does not mean that it's not scientific. We saw some presentations this morning that talked about the scientific method. So as long as we use the scientific method for studies inside the liberal arts, they can intersect and be both scientific and from the liberal arts. They're not mutually exclusive. One is a methodology and the other is an area of study. So liberal arts are science as well. So perhaps it's a little bit easier to talk about what liberal arts are not. So as I said, liberal arts does not mean that it's not scientific. The other thing is that we usually don't consider such things as medicine and nursing to be inside the liberal arts. As Frater Dave mentioned, my day job, I work at a university in California. And so what I've noticed in working with universities around the world is that they will determine which college different programs go into, depending on how much of a focus they have in the liberal arts. So for example, I've done a lot of work in India with engineering colleges. And in fact, in some of those universities, they classify engineering as a liberal art because they believe that engineers need to have a very solid sense of aesthetics and beauty and humanity. And that's what makes them good engineers and able to give back to society, because they have that concept or that foundation, that breadth and depth of human knowledge and understanding that contributes to their profession as an engineer. So even something as what we usually call the hard sciences, or STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, those can be included inside the liberal arts depending on what kinds of courses students might take inside those programs. the liberal arts usually don't include sciences such as information technology and computer science, although perhaps the same argument could be made if we wanted to give these students a larger exposure to the liberal arts inside their programs. So now I'll talk a little bit about the cultural influences on esoteric tradition studies that I would like to propose. So in order to do that, I need to give you a little bit of background. So as good science does in a lit review, which would be the first part of a scientific publication, the writer will take you through the trajectory of history and show you the scientific studies that have been done in that field leading up until the current moment. So I would like to look back upon some studies that have been done in culture in general, and then we'll talk about how we might apply those to this particular study. So if we look back, one of the most famous researchers about culture is a man named Gert Hofstede. And many of you may be familiar with his work. It's rather famous. He was a researcher. He worked at IBM starting in the 1960s through the 1980s. And as a scientist and a worker at IBM, he had access to very large numbers of employees around the world. And so his research was based in the corporate world, so it does have a bit of a managerial flavor to it because those were all of his research participants. But he came up with a very interesting concept of culture. And he came up with these different continua on which culture can be measured. So for example, he looked at a measure of power distance in culture. And so power distance is, for example, in Asian cultures, we tend to have very high power distance. So in Korea, for example, where the managers are supposed to lead through their authority. They tell the subordinates what to do. They don't use a collaborative method of leadership. They tell the subordinates what to do, and subordinates are expected to follow. They don't question, and they don't give their opinion. They answer. And so they're on the extreme end of power distance, whereas more collaborative or egalitarian cultures might have more give and take, and they would be less on the power distance scale. He also talked about masculinity, and this talks about traditional male and female roles. So in a culture that's very masculine, men generally do not help with what are traditionally considered to be women's tasks. So they won't help with child rearing or in the kitchen. So this is typical in Islamic cultures, and in Italy, for example, men generally do not participate in these types of activities. So they're high on masculinity. Whereas in Scandinavian cultures, men even receive a sizable paternity leave. So they're considered lower on the scale of masculinity. Another scale that he looked at was called individualism. So these scales are on a scale of 0 to 100, and the United States is 98 on a scale of individualism. So it is the most individualistic culture in the world. It's where people look out for number one, right? You're responsible for yourself and taking care of yourself. In individualistic cultures, we tend not to take care of our elders when they become old. We might put them in an old folks' home. And in cultures that would be on the opposite end of that continuum, they would take care of their elders maybe in a group setting where there's extended family. The UK is just below the US on this scale, and then there's a very large gap until we start to get into some of the other societies. Uncertainty avoidance is when people really need to know what's going to happen next. They feel very uncomfortable if they don't know what's going to happen next. So Germany, for example, is very high on uncertainty avoidance. If they tell you to be there at 5 o'clock, you better arrive at 4:58 and be waiting out in front of the door, ready to knock at 5 o'clock. But in some other cultures, If you show up for a party at 5, the hostess is going to kill you because she's still taking a shower, right? So that's the opposite end of that extreme. Long-term orientation is being able to plan for the future. So in the US and in developed economies in Europe, we're able to take out a 30-year mortgage because we're pretty sure our house is still going to be there in 30 years and we're not going to get into hyperinflation. We'll still be able to pay for the mortgage. Whereas in war-torn societies, nobody's looking at real estate development because you just can't even plan for what's going to happen tomorrow, much less 30 years down the line. So there was a very, very interesting study that was then later conducted by a group of scientists, and they called it the GLOBE study, which stands for Global Leadership in Educational Effectiveness. It was led by House, and their major publication was in 2004. It's a very interesting study. It took place in over 137 countries with hundreds of participants in this research. So imagine coordinating something like that, where they had research teams going on all around the world. So they also worked in a business setting, so they're focusing on leadership. And as good science does, they used Hofstede's work as their basis, and then they did more research and they refined that and contributed to our understanding of culture. So they adapted Hofstede's scale, they added some new scales to it, and changed some of the ones that he already had. So they kept uncertainty avoidance, and that's still pretty much the same. Then they kept power distance, and that's pretty much the same too as what Hofstede saw. But then they took that individualism scale and they changed it and broke it into two, and they call it collectivism 1 and collectivism 2. So collectivism 1 is looking at collectivism on the societal level, on the larger macrocosm inside society. And they're looking more at distribution of resources. So for example, in Scandinavian societies, with the revenues that come from natural gas, all of that is given back to society. They had free higher education and free computers for everyone when computers were brand new. So they've been giving back to society and investing in infrastructure. Whereas in other cultures, there might be a lot of corruption and all of that money would just go into the pockets of the very few. And then they talked about collectivism 2, which is looking at more of the family scale inside the society. So it's how much do family members or group members or tribe members take care of their own and take care of each other? How cohesive is that group? Then they added a new scale called assertiveness. So assertiveness is how much can a person advocate for their own rights inside a society. I spent a lot of time in Brazil. I lived there for quite many years. And there you need to be very, very assertive in order to get what is rightfully yours. If you're not assertive and you don't speak up for yourself, you'll be eaten alive. It's a constant battle. You really have to fight, like for example, even to get your own money out of the bank. And it's just like a daily battle. And you have to be extremely rude about it or else nothing will get done. It just won't happen. So you have to be very, very assertive. Whereas in Thailand, if you raise your voice, you'll be entirely ignored. People will just shut you out. It's not a way to get something done. So they're on the opposite end of that continuum. So this is an interesting way of looking at culture and society. They kept the future orientation scale, but they added some layers of subtlety to it. So they started looking at, for example, delaying gratification. So maybe saving up to buy a new car. I gave the example of hyperinflation before. So in cultures where we have a stable economy, you can delay gratification. You can save and plan for tomorrow. If there's hyperinflation, forget it. You better spend it now because tomorrow your money's going to be worthless. Then they added another scale also that's called performance orientation. So it's how much does a culture value high performance? In some micro groups or subgroups within cultures, it might be a value that people do not perform well. So for example, in inner city schools, sometimes very, very bright students will pretend like they're not so bright, because if they stick out, then their friends will make fun of them and say, oh, you're too good for us, you don't want to be with us anymore, you think you can break out and get out of here. And so they might underperform in order to continue to be accepted by their group. The opposite example would be in Jewish families. High performance is a value that is esteemed. So children are expected to do well. They are expected to be straight A students and to be professionals upon graduation. So those are some examples of opposite extremes on that scale. In the Globe study, they also added a construct called humane orientation. And that means how much people are caring and giving and worried about others in their culture and in their society. How much charitable contributions do they give? How much do they worry about taking care of others? So it's worried about humanity. So let's talk a little bit about culture in general and what that is. How do you define culture? So according to Globe studies, they define it as shared motives, values, beliefs, identities, and interpretations or meanings of significant events that result from common experiences of members of collectives. And one very important component of that is that it's transmitted across generations. So culture is something that's transmitted down the line. It's a collective belief system, and we pass those beliefs on to our children, and they tend to believe them unless something is introduced to cause them to question their beliefs. Otherwise, the culture will continue. Others have defined culture as the human-made part of the environment. So it's not the natural environment, but it's everything that we make. Our houses, our technology, our food, our clothing, our beliefs, our literature, our music, etc. is all culture. And it's also a shared meaning system. So inside a culture, we have the same beliefs and values. We share that meaning. Others look at culture on a national scale. So we need to be a little bit careful of that, but that is our first concept of culture as we think about Brazilian culture, for example. And whenever we have a large geographical space, we tend to have many subcultures within that location. So in Brazil, from north to south, we have very many different cultures, just like in the US. So any large space is going to tend to have a lot of cultures, or very densely populated areas. So you might see in New York that there's very different cultures according to the neighborhood that you live in. So cultures tend to evolve along time according to external threats. So if the culture is very cohesive and not permeable, that means that the society is very tight-knit, then they're less likely to change throughout time as a result of threats from others outside of their culture. If it's a more permeable culture where you have others who enter into that culture and come and go more easily, then the culture tends to adapt and change with time. That being said, that nations do have subcultures in them, Globe was also able to group cultures into culture clusters. So I referred to Scandinavian societies a couple of times in examples. So they have a lot of similarities. If you look at those continua, they all tend to score very similarly. So if you look at Denmark versus Sweden versus Norway, they tend to be similar. So we can kind of group them into the Nordic Europe, for example. And Germanic Europe is very different from Latin Europe. So all of that is background information that brings us up to the point in which I would like to explain the research proposal for the cultural influences on esoteric traditions. So here's the research question. Utilizing results from House's Globe study, in their respective cultures of origin, what factors may have contributed towards the genesis of the four major esoteric traditions: Gnosticism, alchemy, Kabbalah, and Hermeticism. Basically, what I'm trying to get to, and what I'm interested in looking at, is can we take the globe study and apply their definitions of culture to the point in time in which these esoteric traditions began, and see if there are any commonalities in the cultures that give rise to esoteric traditions. Can we see if there's some kind of a similarity there? So this is what I'm interested in looking at. Secondly, did you want to go back to that slide and get a picture of it? You can't see it? Too bright? The screen is too bright? Yeah? You can see it okay, but in the back? Yeah, I had trouble with it in an earlier presentation. There are some then secondary research questions that I would like to look at inside that same study, or perhaps as a subsequent study. But the question would be, how did the values, lifestyles, and ways of thinking impact the esoteric traditions in regards to notions of identity and spirituality? And also, what were the culture-based hidden assumptions and worldviews of these cultures of origin? So I know that this is a lot to think about. It's a huge research question, and I'm very interested in your feedback, your thoughts, your ideas. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, this is rather different from the other presentations that you've seen in that we haven't actually started this study yet. So, as I've been talking to different people about these studies, we've come up with some assumptions and caveats. So I would just like to make it very, very clear that I have no intention whatsoever of reinventing the wheel and trying to explain these four major esoteric traditions. That has been done. There's a lot of literature on that. That's not my intention here. My intention is to go back and to study the cultures as they were at the time when these esoteric traditions began. The difficulty is identifying when they began. This is kind of hard to do. When is that moment when they started? It's very hard to identify. And then as time goes along, they do tend to influence each other. That was really weird. So they tend to cross-pollinate and influence each other, and so it becomes difficult to tease them apart. So we really have to go back to the very beginning if we're able to conduct this study. So that's a question. Is this feasible? Can this be done? Can we go back to that point in time and identify when these traditions began? And can we take this modern instrument that has been developed in the 2000s to measure culture and go back, and based on the literature that has been produced, can we use this modern instrument to apply it and try to understand and measure those cultures at that time? So obviously we can't use it as a questionnaire as it is now and go back and ask people what their perceptions were. We'll have to make some interpretations based on the literature and what's been produced. So an initial lit review would include very, very concise summaries of the four major esoteric traditions. I'm just trying to get at the very basic points to orient a reader for this type of a study. And then perhaps look at a very quick comparative analysis of these studies and see what the commonalities and the similarities are. because my hypothesis is that we will find some similarities in the cultures. I think that there's probably something similar in a culture that will cause it to create this type of a body of knowledge, this type of esoteric tradition. So we might want to compare the traditions too. We would give a very quick summary of House's study, their globe study, and then look a little bit at these definitions of culture and what cross-cultural research is. So that being said, that's research study 1, and that's a really big project, and I would love to get your feedback on that later. But then I'd like to talk right now a little bit about some other research proposals that I have. So here's research proposals 2, 3, and 4. So these are some potential follow-on projects. They're similar, they're related to that first one, and they don't necessarily need to be done sequentially, but some of the ideas are how might these esoteric traditions have influenced education? As Frater Dave introduced me, I'm the Dean of a College of Education. I work at university. This is my day job, my life, and so I'm very interested in education and the future directions of education. So I would be interested in looking at perhaps how esoteric traditions influence education and vice versa. I realize that it's not a unidirectional phenomenon that we're trying to study here. Another area of interest of mine is in the healing arts. So I would also be interested in looking at healing arts at these, at the point in time in which these esoteric traditions began, and even in the present moment, and see if there are some influences there. Then we could also look at some other esoteric traditions. I chose those 4 as being 4 major ones that I think would be very interesting to start with. But I would also like to look at other cultures like African tribal cultures, Asian cultures. I've been talking to somebody who has done a lot of research on Knights Templar. And so she has actually really been able to go back and trace the timeline, and she's pretty close to being able to identify where it began. It's not super clear, but she's done a lot of work in that aspect. So there's a possibility that we might even start with a study like that, where we're looking at the cultural influences of what began in the Knights Templar. So we could look at spiritism or shamanism and some different types of traditions also. So that being said, I think that really what we're looking at here is spirituality, and what are the commonalities of spirituality. And so I'm very interested in looking at how do we measure or look at spirituality that is agnostic of these traditions, so independent of these traditions, and just looking at spirituality as a construct in isolation of traditions. So I've looked, there might be a possibility, for example, of taking a measurement of spirituality and applying it to different groups. So perhaps we could work with the different lodges and get authorization and see if we might apply some questionnaires to draw some conclusions about what kinds of people are spiritual and what kinds of spiritual people get involved in mystical traditions. So I'd like to give you a little bit of background on some research that I've done on spirituality scales. So I've identified several different instruments that look at spirituality. So the first one is a spiritual well-being scale, and that's a 20-item self-administered scale that looks at spiritual well-being. So it's important when we use a scale that it be small and concise and easy to apply. Self-administered scales are very nice because it allows you to reach a larger number of respondents. It's easier for them to participate in the study. Lost my train of thought. Let's go on to the next one. So there's another one called the Spirituality Self-Rating Scale. And this is an individual's orientation towards spirituality. One of the issues with the spirituality scales is that many of them also tend to measure religiosity, which is very different from spirituality. Religiosity is seen as an external demonstration, going to church, showing certain behaviors, wearing certain clothes, doing certain practices that are associated with a religion. whereas spirituality tend to be seen as more of an internal construct. So it's a belief system that is within oneself, that you don't necessarily need to demonstrate to others as participating in a spiritual group. So with Aquino's religious scale, this is a bit of a problem, because it tends to evaluate religious attitude more, because the items in the scale refer to God and church and some constructs that we might not associate with spiritual beliefs. There's another interesting scale, the Hukol scale, and this measures well-being. So there's a very high correlation between well-being and spirituality. So well-being is someone's sense of how good they feel. Do they feel happy? Do they feel satisfied? Are they at peace with their day-to-day life? So people who are highly spiritual tend to have high measures of well-being. So there's some interesting correlations there that we might look into. And then there's this daily spiritual experience scale. So this is a nice scale that has been able to look at spirituality a little bit separate from religiosity. Although nothing to impede us from comparing and looking at church-going groups versus people who go to different types of spiritual organizations, and looking at some comparative analyses there. So then we'll move on to research proposals 5 through 100. You laugh, it's true. So here are just some of the things that I'm interested in. So here's a long list of ideas. So for any of you who are interested in these areas, or perhaps something else, but I just wanted to throw out a lot of liberal arts ideas of things that I'm particularly interested in. So my role here is I'm really trying to form different research groups. So we could have 3 or 4 different research studies going on at the same time, and I'm more than happy to help to coordinate those efforts and to help to guide people. If anybody is new to research and they're interested in getting involved in it, or if you want to collaborate but you're not willing to take on a whole research project on your own, and let's make many hands make light work and form some groups and do some research together. So I'm interested in looking at peak experiences. This is really typical of athletes. So when they're doing marathons or winning a race or having some very intense experiences, this is also very closely related to spirituality and to well-being. So we might look into something like that. I'm interested in looking at flow, the concept of flow. Flow is when you're so in the moment, you don't realize that time is passing by. This is very common with artists and athletes. So if you can think of Leonardo da Vinci and painting all day long, or Michelangelo, and they get so engrossed in their work that they don't even know that the whole day has gone by and they've been able to create a masterpiece, and they just lose all concept of everything else that's going on around them. I've done some presentations on flow in the classroom, because my theory is that learning should not be arduous, and it should not be torture for the students, that they should be happy to be there, and so should the teacher. It should be an enjoyable experience, and we should forget time and not be looking at our watch and waiting for when we can get out of class. I'm also interested in looking at altered states of consciousness. And at the opening yesterday, we heard about the states of consciousness from Dr. David Hawkins, and that is another area that I'm also interested in. So as was mentioned at the opening, Dr. David Hawkins looks at consciousness on a scale from 0 to 100. And so they're able to measure the level of consciousness of political ideologies, of books, of music, of discourse, of speeches. It's a very, very interesting area for further research. I'm interested in the field of meditation and mindfulness. So mindfulness is basically being aware of our responses to situations and not responding based on our emotion, but controlling our emotions in order to respond in a more coherent manner that might get us results that we're looking for. It's very closely correlated to emotional intelligence. And I'm also interested in looking at mantras. So mantras are very similar to the vowel sounds. However, mantras originate from Eastern traditions, and they tend to be words or phrases that are repeated as opposed to isolated vowel sounds. So I would be really interested in talking about potential future research for that. I'll mention something about that in a minute on the next slide. I'm also really interested in looking at happiness. Happiness has become a very hot research topic lately. There are some economies in the world that are focusing on happiness as opposed to GDP. That they're more interested in their populations being happy than on their material production. So in, I think it's in Bhutan, they have a happiness index as opposed to their, right? So they've chosen to not create dams on their rivers to provide hydroelectric energy to China because they would rather have the rivers for their population to go and enjoy. So they're rather focusing on that as opposed to economic development. I'm interested in creating manifestations in our lives and how we can create things that we would like to see manifest in our lives. I'm also a yoga teacher, so I'm particularly interested in Kundalini yoga or Yoga Nidra, if you know what those are. Pranayama are breathing techniques, which also come from Eastern traditions. So we talk about that, about positive and negative breathing and holding our breath and how that influences our state of being. It influences blood pressure and a lot of other physiological responses. I'm interested in Tantra and Kali and color therapy, gemstone therapy, floral, herbal remedies, so you name it. I'm quite eclectic, right? And so the next slide. As I mentioned, I'm in education, so I'm interested in anything to do with education, particularly educational technology and the future of education. I'm very interested in the healing arts, which I mentioned before. So pranic healing is working with breathing and how that affects healing. Reiki is a Japanese tradition. Marma points is an Indian tradition. And I also work with medical Qigong. So there's something very interesting that I'd like to talk to you about later, but in medical Qigong, we use healing sounds. So we have particular healing sounds that we use like to affect the liver or the heart or the spleen, and we direct those sounds to specific organs. However, in medical Qigong, we have the belief that we can do it silently, and it's just as powerful as saying it out loud. So that might be an interesting study, is where we could have a control group and compare doing healing sounds aloud or silently and see if we still get some effects silently. I'm also interested in Ayurveda and similar to the work of Deepak Chopra, who was able to bridge East and West. So he was a Ayurvedic practitioner in India, but he's a medical doctor in Western science. He's an endocrinologist, and he's done a lot of research on how East meets West. And so he's provided scientific research that substantiates some of the common knowledge that we have of Ayurveda and how it's been helpful for 2,000 years. They've been practicing it and getting results, but he's able to provide this Western scientific justification of the results that we find. I'm very interested in the work of Steven Pinker and psychological anthropology. He explains how evolution affects how we are today. And you wouldn't believe how we're so like cavemen. Right? We're just grown-up cavemen when we're not so hairy anymore. I'm very interested in emotional intelligence and the work of Daniel Goleman, in leadership, in business, international business, which is also the other realm I work in, and quality of life, and neuro-linguistic programming, and other suggestions. So just a few ideas to get you started. If you want to add anything to the list, feel free. But now, what do we need? So this is the reason I'm here. Call to action. What I'm looking for predominantly are subject matter experts, or as we affectionately call them, SMEs, to help me with the major esoteric traditions. So I need people who are experts on Kabbalah, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, and alchemy, who can help me with that lit review and sifting through all of that vast amount of information that's available out there. And if there's anybody who can try to help me to identify the point in time in which these esoteric traditions began, so that we might be able to do that initial study that I proposed, where we can use House's globe study and that scale and try to measure culture at that point in time. So I'm really looking for people who can do some heavy lifting and help to write the lit review and do some writing, perhaps help with data collection or data analysis. So I've run into a lot of people who say, well, yeah, I'm really busy. I'd love to look at your paper when it's done. Doesn't really help. I can do that. So, yeah, I mean, the more eyes, the merrier. I love to get everybody's feedback, but I really need some help. So, here is my contact information. So if you would like to get in touch with me, if we don't have an opportunity to connect better during this conference, if some ideas come to mind later, I would love to hear them. If you know somebody who might be interested in helping in one of these studies, please refer them to me and we can talk and see if we can get them involved in some way. So we have a couple of minutes left for questions. So we'll open the floor. I guess there's one in the back.
Well, we thank you for this presentation. It's really excellent, and I was impressed by the broadness of your vision.
Thank you.
And I was wondering, because you're so creative and knowledgeable and broad, did you consider to include the current crisis we have with our youth? Because I think it might be a socio-economic issue, and that is underlying that whole thing. Education as well, if you are into education. I think our education, our society, our upbringing, and they don't think like we used to think. So is there any plan and research to see how we could help them?
Yes, thank you for asking that. Actually, we have discussed that, and that is one of the areas that we're looking at for sure. There is a big problem with youth right now because education is changing so much. There's some very interesting statistics on, I can't remember what the exact numbers are, but something like by the year 2020, 80% of the jobs that will exist then don't even exist now. Don't exist. So how can you plan if you're a youngster and you're in high school and you're planning on going to the university, and what field do you want to go into, and mom and dad are pushing you to go into med school or become an engineer, and you don't even know when you graduate if that job is still going to be there or it's going to be entirely different. So it's very hard for today's youth, for sure. There's so many changes. So yes, we have talked about that, and that is an area I would love to explore. Absolutely.
I just wanted to make a comment about the Rosicrucian Digest. The early Rosicrucian Digests are just excellent.
Yes.
And fortunately, a lot of the older lodges have them down.
Yes.
And it is just amazing. So you're talking about the origins.
Right.
Also, H. Spencer Lewis had created a keyboard that was a correlation between color and sound. So there is a tremendous amount of research that has been done when we had the research library.
Right.
Early on. Those early Rosicrucians were all about the research.
Nice.
So in those old Rosicrucian digests are gold mines.
Right, yes, that's where I started, was looking at the timeline series, so thank you, yes, that's really helpful. Although I wasn't able to find my point of origin, but it was useful to get a good overview, for sure.
You had a lot of information on the slideshow that was impossible to write down. I'd like to get a copy of the slideshow and the presentation because there's a whole lot of information in there, and there's a whole lot of stuff that I'd like to get involved in associated with that.
All right, great. We'll see what we're going to do and how we'll make those available, for sure.
I could, I got my flash drive to check on the computer.
Okay, let's see what the protocol is with that, and I'm more than happy to share. I'm just not sure how we'll go about it. I gave this same presentation in Boston a couple of last month, I guess, and so I took the audio and I put the audio together with the PowerPoint, because I think the PowerPoint itself doesn't do itself justice. So I'm willing to make that available to people as well if that's authorized. Okay. All right, sure.
Okay, so you made a point about that there's certain things that aren't covered by the liberal arts. And one of them was like technology, like IT.
Right.
And in a way I would challenge that. I've been a programmer for many years.
Right.
And I can teach anybody how to use programming language. I can't necessarily teach them how to be a programmer, because there's a certain extent to which it's art. How do you think through a problem?
Nice.
So, logic, which logic is from the art.
Sure.
And another example would be like doctors of osteopathy, who they go beyond the normal medical sciences and apply other ideas. So I don't think there's anything that's really isolated from the liberal arts.
Right.
That it just might be expressed in different ways.
Sure. I tried to make that point when I gave the example about engineering, and I said that even engineering is considered a liberal art, depending on how much emphasis you give towards the liberal arts. I'm just saying that traditionally, medicine and nursing and computer science are not included in the liberal arts, but I agree with you. The point is almost everything is a liberal art, and liberal art is science.
Well, to predicate what the other father said, when I was at MIT, when you studied to be a poet, you said there was a humanities course 21. The people who were studying to be poets or to be liberal arts majors were the ones that had to do calculus as well. So it's amazing how in Western society we have the almost the addiction to separate things into silos. And I myself work in IT, and one of the greatest challenges we have is to break down those silos. And it's just, I remember when we talk about in philosophy, when we give the name to something, you basically take away its ability to be named other things. So I think the classification as a liberal arts, yes or no, is not really what's important, but the studies that you're doing and in the traditions is really the main focus of the work. So thank you.
Thank you. Good point.
Are you willing to consider collaboration with other research groups that are not necessarily Rosicrucians?
Sure, absolutely. Dave, there's one in the back.
Just one more question.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was absolutely amazing.
Thank you.
Very interested in every topic that you presented today.
Thank you. All 100?
One topic that you did not have posted, but you said if we had any suggestions, and I have a suggestion that involves music therapy.
Oh.
In particular, not, but how it affects our consciousness and how the vibrational frequencies can align with us and how they affect us good, bad, or indifferent. I think we tend to take music for granted, and particularly the musicians who are so gifted and talented and who work so hard to create this music for us. But if we could just see music as a form of healing, as a culture, I think that it will help to change not just us as individuals, but the country and the world, and we could just see music a lot deeper than what it is.
Great suggestion, thank you. Well,
Let's thank some more Julie.
thank you.